Will the Falcons' revamped defensive line help Grady Jarrett have a career year?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, and the very humble host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And we thank each and every one of you that makes this illustrious podcast your first listen. Make sure you follow in the footsteps of the everydayers by subscribing or following for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today we are continuing our positional breakdowns of the Falcons ahead of training camp, and we will be flipping from the offensive side of the ball to the defensive side of the ball, and we'll start talking about the defensive line. And we'll talk quite a bit about the fact that this offseason the Falcons finally did the thing that we so wanted them to do, which is to get Grady Jarrett some help, right? My bucket list of things that I needed the Falcons to do, this new regime to do, was fix the offensive line and get Grady some help. And I feel like they've accomplished both of those tasks in the last, 12 months. And, when we talk about Grady getting help, and it comes from a conversation I had with a fan recently who was asking me sort of who is the Falcons. He didn't use the exact terms alpha, but I will use the terms alpha because you've heard me talk about, the Falcons having that go-to guy, right? Grady Jarrett's the Batman, and we got him a bunch of Robins this offseason. But this person was asking me because they were listening to a recent episode of the Athletic Football Podcast with Robert Mays and Nate Tice, and they were talking about sort of how many stars like a Super Bowl team needs to have on a recent episode of that podcast. And they were talking about how, a lot of these teams that make these deep postseason runs always have like one defensive pass rusher that over the course of 3 or more postseason games winds up with like 15 or more pressures, according to PFF. And Chris Jones was a great example of this from this past year, where I think he had 20 pressures in the 3 playoff games Chiefs had this past year. And you always seem to get some guy going off down the stretch that is being that sort of dominant alpha type of pass rusher. And this fan was asking me, who's that guy currently on the Falcons in the context of that, episode of another podcast. And I basically was like, Grady is that guy, right? And we heard David Onyemata earlier this offseason talk about how like this is Grady's room, and the veterans like him and Calais Campbell defer to Grady. And I know of one Falcon fan out there that tends to think Grady Jarrett is overrated because Grady Jarrett has not played at an elite level the last couple of years. And, this fan is, on an island, so to speak, and I think the Grady Jarrett's overrated island is worse island than McGarry Island. I would say probably the worst island you could be on. But, I don't think there's any doubt that Grady has not had great seasons these last 2 years in comparison to what he was the previous years. Like from 2017 to 2020, Grady was definitely one of the top D tackles in the league. And I think he kind of peaked in 2019 where he was like the 4th highest graded D tackle according to PFF. And even though he's been playing down these last couple of years, he's still one of the top 32 according to PFF in each of these last 2 years. But I think some of the decline of Grady has been due to the scheme change, where we talked early last week about how the difference between different fronts and one gapping versus 2 gapping, and Dean Pease's scheme wanting Grady to be a little bit more of a 2 gapper, reading react type of player rather than a disruptive penetrator that he was known for in the Dan Quinn, Raheem Morris schemes. And I also think some of Grady's, quote unquote downness is owed to the fact that the Falcons have not had a great supporting cast around him these last 2 seasons, especially. And I think it's led to Grady wearing down a little bit. And you saw this reflected last year, where Grady got off to a great start in 2022, and the first half of the season was balling, and then kind of fizzled out by the time we got to midpoint. Like you look at, we talked about this, I think in January when we did the postseason positional breakdowns, but like Grady had like 24 combined pressures according to PFF in the first 7 games. And that put him on pace to have 58, which would have been a career high for him last year. And it goes back to a conversation I had with Jarvis Davis here on this podcast back in like September. I want to say it was like week 2 or 3, where Jarvis like declared like, yo, Grady's going to have an all-pro season. And that was the type of year that Grady had gotten off to. But by the time we got to the midpoint of the season, things had kind of fizzled out. And I think a lot of that was owed to just deep offenses. I mean, were able to focus primarily on Grady Jarrett. They didn't have to worry about anybody else. And so, whether that's double teams and triple teams or, all those various things, that basically Grady had to put this pass rush and this defensive line on his back. And he was only able to carry it for, 7 or so games. Right. And I think the hope is that now with the pieces that the Falcons have added this offseason, that, you can take some of that burden off of Grady, so that not only, even if he only has 7 good games, you can sprinkle those 7 games throughout the entire season. Right. Or that he can, because he's carrying less weight, that he can shoulder that burden for more than 7 games. That's 12 games. That's 14 games. And hopefully that, down the stretch and hopefully into the postseason, we can see Grady Jarrett be that type of difference maker that this Falcon fan that we started this conversation, talking about, alluded to, being that sort of alpha type of player. So when we look forward to what Grady Jarrett can do this year, I think a lot of it is owed to the supporting cast he's going to have. And I hope we are able to maximize, because of the additions the Falcons have made this offseason on this defensive line room, that we'll able to get Grady Jarrett playing on a good defense for, whatever's left of his prime, whatever is left of his peak, right? I've said before on the podcast that given Grady, being on the quote unquote wrong side of 30, that the expectation is that you're probably only going to get maybe 2 more peak years out of Grady Jarrett moving forward this year and probably 2024. Now, it doesn't mean that in 2025, Grady's going to fall off a cliff. We saw similar with Jonathan Babineau. Like Jonathan Babineau's last peak year was around age 31 in 2012. And it wasn't like Jonathan Babineau fell off a cliff in 2013, but there was a gradual decline to the point that you got in 2016, where Babineau was like, barely performing as a rotational player that year. And so, starting in 2025, I'm sort of expecting Grady to start potentially going on that decline, and how gradual, how steep that decline is remains to be seen. But you want to kind of get the most out of these next 2 years, and hopefully Grady will actually play on a good defense at some point, right? It's been so long since Grady has played on a good defense, or at least a competent defense. Let's say that, we can't have nice things here in Atlanta, but competent defense is the bar that we'll set here for the Falcons. So I'm expecting a rebound year for Grady. Whether he's going to be that top 5 type of D tackle that he was at his peak remains to be seen, but I still expect Grady Jarrett to look like one of the best D tackles in the league, because that player to me is in him, right? We saw it again for the first half of the season. And I think the additions that the Falcons have made this offseason will hopefully allow Grady Jarrett to have that type of year, similar to what he was on pace to start last year with, which was a career year, and be that sort of all-pro caliber D tackle, so that one Falcon fan that I know of that is, sitting here thinking Grady Jarrett's overrated, we can laugh at that person together, because I so desperately want to. But that's just me being petty, right? But we'll talk more about the additions that the Falcons made with David Onyemata, Calais Campbell, what their roles are going to be, what their leadership is going to be, that they can provide for this team moving forward as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. Just like the Atlanta Falcons, you as a small business owner or hiring manager know that success in 2023 all depends on the team members you surround yourself with. That's why you got to check out LinkedIn Jobs, where you can quickly attract and hire qualified candidates by matching the people who have the skills, values, and experiences to help you achieve your goals. Think of it like a defensive line room, right? Where you're trying to add support to your all-pro defensive tackle. So you want to put your job post in front of as many people as possible. And you can do that with LinkedIn Jobs. Put it in front of over 800 million profiles and find the most qualified candidates with LinkedIn Jobs. It's easy to screen and rate applicants based off your job qualifications, all on one platform. It's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs is going to help you find the qualified candidates that you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at LinkedIn.com/LockedOnNFL. That's LinkedIn.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. So continuing today's Locked On Falcons, guys, let's talk a little bit more about the other pieces that the Falcons added this offseason, including David Onyemata, probably the biggest potential impact, although Calais Campbell is probably the biggest name We'll talk a little bit more about Calais Campbell in a second, but Onyemata coming from New Orleans, joining Ryan Nielsen here in Atlanta. The expectation is Nielsen knows him best, and the fact that Onyemata is coming off a bit of a down year. Um, coming off of the suspension that he had in 2021, where he was, one of the best D tackles in the league that year and the previous year. I'm not necessarily worried about Onyemata coming off a down year, but like if we get the 2020, 2021 version of him, where PFF had him rated as the seventh best D tackle in the league in both years, that's going to be a very big problem for opposing offenses this year. The thing that Onyemata brings to the table is the versatility. He, is primarily a three technique pass rusher at that D tackle position in New Orleans, but he can also play one technique. He can play all over the defensive line. That year after Tyler Davison joined the Falcons, he was asked to play a lot more one technique that season and performed well that year. But all the offensive linemen that block him, whether it's Chris Lindstrom, whether it's Ali Marpet, always talk about how formidable an opponent he is. So even though he may not necessarily be a household name for a lot of fans elsewhere, people in New Orleans and any Falcon fan that's, studied the game closely, such as I, so humble, appreciates how very good David Onyemata is. And even if he does have a quote unquote another down season, that's still good for another 30 pressure type of season. Right. And when you look at the combined pressures of the non-Grady Jarrett D tackles for the Falcons in 2022, they only combined for 34 pressures. So David Onyemata is basically at his worst, is basically as good as everybody that the Falcons had, like 6 different players in the D tackle room last year combined, right? And you look at the last time the Falcons had 2 interior D linemen that got 30 plus pressures, Grady Jarrett was one. It was 2018, where Jack Crawford had 32 pressures. Dontari Poe had 37 pressures. So again, a down year for David Onyemata. We're talking about a down year, worst case scenario. Now, best case scenario is we get that 2020, 2021 version of David Onyemata, and that's a guy that could get you upwards of 45, 50 types of pressures and be one of the top 10 D tackles in the league. So I'm looking forward to seeing what version of David Onyemata we get here in Atlanta. Moving forward to Calais Campbell. Now we're talking about the defensive line group, and Campbell's expected to play more of an edge D end, right? He's playing the Cam Jordan role, and Jordan played primarily as a true defensive end in that Saints defense, playing a lot more 6, 7, 9 technique, outside the offensive tackle. Now the expectation is Campbell will get plenty of looks there, but also get plenty of looks inside, right? You'll see him play 5 technique or 4-eye technique over the tackle. You'll see him play 3 technique or 1 technique over some of the guards. And I think that versatility is valuable, right? For all of these guys, right? Whether Grady Jarrett can be moved around, Onyemata can be moved around, Campbell can be moved around, because the value of that is that you're going to get, potentially favorable matchups where you can go up against certain guys where it's like, okay, this guy struggles against power, this guy struggles against speed. Okay, so speed guy will put Grady on him, power guy will put Campbell on him, that sort of thing. So you can feature these guys and allow these guys to put their best foot forward because they're sort of interchangeable, and you can kind of move them around the formation in order to get favorable matchups there. And in addition to not only what Campbell and Onyemata are going to bring on the field, they're also going to bring valuable leadership in the locker room, right? Grady's also a leader. As I said at the top of the show, he is the leader in this defensive line room and probably on the entire football team, right? But you're probably going to get more vocal leadership from Calais Campbell than you will for David Onyemata. All these guys are kind of lead by example because that's the more common leadership type in the NFL, right? I'm going to keep my head down and do my job really well. And if someone comes up to me, that sort of thing, rather than the sort of rah leadership that we all sort of think about, like with a Ray Lewis type of player. But I think this valuable leadership is going to be beneficial for some of the young players that we have behind these guys. Obviously, with Campbell, behind him is Zach Harrison. We'll talk more about Harrison on tomorrow's episode when we get to the edge rushers. But, that year that we have Calais Campbell, who knows where he'll be playing, if he's playing at all in 2024. But that year of Harrison being able to sit behind Campbell, he'll be able to sort of sit there and be a sponge, hopefully, for that. And, who's going to be that guy for Grady and David Onyemata? Because unlike Campbell, they should be locked up at least for another 2 years with their contracts. They're signed through beyond that, but their contracts are pretty good for the next 2 seasons. And so, whether that's Taquan Graham or whether that's bringing in somebody else, you hope that you can get one of these young guys to also be a sponge and be able to take be taken under those guys' wings, similar to how Grady Jarrett was taken under Jonathan Babineaux's wings early in his career. Grady has spoken about sort of the value that Babineau gave him early in his career. And unfortunately, we didn't necessarily get the very best of Babineau and the best of Grady. They were kind of two ships passing in the night, with Babineau on the declining and Grady on the ascension. So hopefully before, time is up with Grady, as I spoke with earlier, we'll be able to get some young up and coming player to join him. But maybe that player is Taquan Graham, and we'll talk a little bit more about him as well as some of the other young defensive linemen we have in the room, as well as another veteran that is expected to contribute this year. But we have a lot more iffy concerns and expectations for that player, and that is, of course, Eddie Goldman. So we'll talk about those expectations for Eddie Goldman as we continue today's Locked On Falcons, guys. But before we get there, I do want to give a shout out to my everydayers that tune in each and every day. And of course, all week long, we'll be breaking down more of the positions on the defensive side of the ball ahead of training camp, talking about the big storylines, the big roster battles, competitions, all that and more. And tomorrow, of course, for my everydayers, we'll be talking all about the edge rushers. So make sure you tune into that here on Locked On Falcons. Bird Dogs provide super comfortable pants, shorts, and sweats. They have stretch khaki shorts that are designed to fit slimmer through the thigh and leg and give you that truly sculpted look, right? They fit way better than regular shorts that are made of stiff, restrictive cotton. And I myself had an interesting experience with Bird Dogs this past weekend because I went on a mini vacation to the beach and I forgot to pack my swim trunks. And you know what I just wound up using? I just used Bird Dogs instead to go, swim in the ocean. And they have their little built-in liners in their shorts, and it keeps everything nice, snug, and cozy. So whether you forget to pack things on your vacation or you just want to have a staycation and just look better and have that slimmer fit that don't have to sacrifice movement, go ahead, try Bird Dogs yourself. Head on over to birddogs.com/LockedOnNFL, and you'll get a free Yeti style tumbler with your order with something, a little similar to this. That's birddogs.com/LockedOnNFL for a free Yeti style tumbler. You won't want to take your Bird Dogs off. We promise you. So wrapping up today's Locked On Falcons, guys, let's talk about the rest of this D-line room, and let's start talking about Eddie Goldman, another veteran, but much more of an unknown compared to David Onyemata and Calais Campbell and Grady Jarrett, right? And the timeline for Eddie Goldman is a fascinating one, right? Because he spent several years in Chicago, was a very good D tackle there. And in 2019, his last sort of great year in Chicago, balled out that year. Then the following year, due to COVID, sat out that season. 2021 came back to play for the Bears, but kind of looked like a shell of himself. And that caused a lot of Bears fans that I know questioning whether or not he was still committed to playing football, and probably in lieu of that, sit out the previous year. But he did wind up signing with the Atlanta Falcons in July of 2022, but then unfortunately retired about 12 days later. And then this past March decided that he wanted to play football again, and the Falcons brought him off that reserve retired list. And so what version of Eddie Goldman are we going to get this year? Are we going to get the 2019 Bears version? Are we going to get the 2021 Bears version? Or are we going to get something else? And that remains to be seen. He is much more of a unknown commodity compared to the other D linemen in the room. But the selling point for Eddie Goldman is the same selling point that I sat here on this podcast back in July of last summer telling you about, which is Eddie Goldman is a nose tackle, but he's that rare sort of 3-down nose tackle that can give you value on passing downs. While he's not an elite pass rusher, generally, my expectations last summer was that at the minimum, he'll give you 20 to 25 pressures this year, which, if that's your fourth best interior defensive lineman, that's a very good, interior group that we're hoping that we're going to see. Now, I think in terms of probably more realistic expectations for Eddie Goldman this year is the hope that he may not get as many opportunities to be the 3-down guy that he was in Chicago because of the presence of guys like Grady Jarrett and David Onyemata. But if he can just give us value as a 2-down guy, right, and be a force against the run on those early downs that can keep Grady Jarrett and David Onyemata fresh on those downs, and so they can be, sort of sidelined and save themselves for passing situations and third downs, that would be ideal, I think, for Eddie Goldman. So I think really the goal for Eddie Goldman this summer, and we'll see what he looks like with the Falcons kind of bringing him along slowly to try to get him back into shape or whatever, playing shape or whatever, is just kind of be a key part of the rotation, right? You don't necessarily need to be that, top 3 D lineman that you were in Chicago at your peak. You just kind of need, be the 4th best D lineman on this team, and maybe be the 6th best, when you factor in the edge rushers, just be a good 6th or 7th man in this rotation. And if you can get sort of, something in between the 2019 and 2021 versions, that's a really valuable piece in your rotation. Another potential valuable piece in the Falcons rotation will be Taquan Graham. He's coming off the knee injury. And to me, with Taquan Graham, he's one of the few young guys we have in this room that is expected to stick on the roster. And I'm very curious to see what type of growth we see from Taquan Graham in year 3, right? We saw a big jump from him from year 1 to year 2. We saw him be an impactful rotational piece, impactful run stopper. We saw some flashes as a pass rush ability, but the big knock on Taquan Graham is, he's a very powerful player, very long player, can bully guys, but didn't really have any pass rush moves. So you didn't see a lot of sack production because he really struggled to disengage blocks. He was able to collapse the pocket because of that power. And so you're hoping that with the veterans that we have that can sort of take him under the wing and show him, some tricks, as well as what we're going to get from defensive line coach Ryan Nielsen, the noted pass rush guru, you're hoping to see that type of growth from Taquan Graham where we can actually see, hey, can we get a pass rush move this year? And even if it's a simple swim move or a hump move or whatever you need to do, if we can get that from Taquan Graham, that would be tremendous growth for him. I think for Graham, I'm not necessarily expecting him to be a starter. I think he's probably better suited to be more of a high-end rotational player, like that number 3 guy in your rotation, and sort of take over, and tag team with Eddie Goldman and be a really valuable run defender on the interior. Again, helping to keep guys like Onyemata and Grady Jarrett fresh for third downs. And so that's kind of what I'm hoping from Graham this season. So hopefully we can see him be a little bit more than what he was prior to his injury. Just say, what he was in the first, 2/3 of the season before his injury, and then a little bit plus, just a little bit more as a pass rusher in that regard. And that will be, to me, a tremendous sign for Taquan Graham that he's clearly sort of reaching his potential ceiling in this league and being a very valuable contributor to this defensive line rotation. But he's sort of the headliner of the young guys that we have in D-line, and the Falcons kind of remade their defensive line room, brought in a bunch of young guys. Everybody else that we're going to talk about on the rest of the episode is 26 years old or younger. And so you're kind of hoping, because you have all these veteran pieces, that maybe one or more of these young guys in the back end of the rotation kind of emerge. Don't know if any of these guys are going to make the roster, because my current expectation is there will be 5 D linemen kept: Grady Jarrett, Onyemata, Campbell, Graham, and Eddie Goldman. As mentioned, Goldman's probably on the most tenuous of ground of this group because you just don't know what exactly he's going to be this year. And so does one of these young guys emerge and maybe make Eddie Goldman expendable, or does one of these young guys emerge and say, okay, because guys like Campbell and Goldman are on 1-year deals, you want to have a sort of developmental guy that can slide in and replace one of these guys in the future, or at least on the back end of the rotation. Again, not expecting those, the Carlos Davises of the world to leapfrog and be, on the same level as Calais Campbell, but you get what I'm saying, right? So, who's going to have a good camp? Who's going to sort of make their name known? Timmy Horn's the one guy that's kind of the holdover from last year. I thought Horn played well in the second half of the season, got off to a little bit of a slow start as an undrafted free agent, but got better as the season wore on. But you've seen the Falcons kind of remake this room after the draft, bringing guys like Carlos Davis from the Steelers, Albert Huggins, formerly at the Saints, LaCale London from the XFL, sort of indicating what we thought going into the draft, that the Falcons would like to get a D tackle. And so this is just an indicator to me that, they weren't able to get that D tackle in the draft. And so they decided, okay, let's revamp this group. You also bring in Joe Gaziano, kind of the forgotten free agent signing in March, likely to probably be a little bit more of that D end behind Campbell and Zach Harrison, which is what he played at Northwestern in college. But with the Chargers, these last couple of years been more of an undersized D tackle. So we'll see what we can get from Joe Gazion. So I'm looking forward to seeing what, if any of these guys sort of emerge, in this third string defensive line room, if one of those guys shows that he can be a keeper, whether that's as a guy that does make a bid for the 53-man roster, or is that just a practice squad stash? Either way, I think having a young player, one of these guys that's 25, 26, waiting in the wings, that you can sit there and say, okay, I think there's some potential for this guy to be a valuable contributor in our rotation, down the road, I think will be very valuable for the Falcons. But we'll sort of have to see, who emerges this summer. Maybe the Falcons do some further reshuffling before we get to the season. We'll sort of have to see about that. But that is going to do it for us here, talking about the D-line group here on today's Locked On Falcons, guys. We'll be back with more on the edge rusher group on tomorrow's episode, talking about the Arnold Ebiketie. Can he emerge to be more of that alpha, make that big year 2 jump that we're hoping to see from him? What can we expect from some of the other young pass rushers like D'Angelo Malone and Eddie Ogundeji, as well as the veterans like Bud Dupree and Lorenzo Carter? So we'll talk more about those guys along with Zach Harrison on tomorrow's episode when we break down the edge rusher group, guys. But that's going to do it for us here on today's Locked On Falcons. Really appreciate all you guys that make us your first listen. For your second listen, check out Locked On NFL. Of course, check out all the other Locked On Sports Atlanta shows: Locked On Braves, Locked On Bulldogs, Locked On Hawks, and ATL Day Ones, and Hitting Hard with John Chuckery, all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.